The hallway outside room 14 smelled like eucalyptus diffuser oil and the particular kind of quiet that settles over a place where people come to die, not the violent protesting kind of dying, where the family has already signed the paperwork and the nurses speak in low voices, and everyone is very careful not to say the word out loud. Delphine Marchetti stood at the medication cart, counting milliliters of liquid morphine into a small plastic cup, her handwriting precise and unhurried in the log beside it. She was 34 years old, and she had the hands of someone twice that, not aged, exactly, just capable in a way that living hands rarely are, the knuckles a little thick, the tendons visible when she flexed. Old scars, most of them faded to a dull silver, running in thin, irregular lines across the dorsal surface of her right hand and disappearing into the cuff of her scrub top. She wore her scrubs a size too large. She had done this for years, without thinking about it anymore, the same way she always chose the chair closest to the exit in any room, the same way she clocked the positions of every person present whenever she walked through a door. These were not habits she had cultivated consciously. They were the residue of a life she no longer officially lived. The hospice unit at Mercy Providence Medical Center occupied the entire 7th floor, and it was quiet in the way that places built for endings tend to be, a quiet held in place by institutional carpet and acoustic ceiling tiles, and the low hum of oxygen concentrators cycling their slow mechanical breath. Delphine had worked this floor for 3 years. She had learned to love it in the way you can only love something that asks very little pretending of you. Nobody came to a hospice unit expecting miracles. There was a strange freedom in that. She picked up the chart for room 14, Admiral Chester Vane, United States Navy, retired, 81 years old. Stage 4 non-small cell lung cancer, with metastatic spread to the spine, the liver, and, as of last Tuesday's imaging, the brain. He had been transferred from a private oncology practice in Annapolis 3 weeks ago, when his daughter finally persuaded him that the 90-minute drive for treatments that were no longer doing anything was not a dignified use of what the palliative care team estimated was. He had arrived with 2 aides, a stack of naval history books he never opened, and a complete refusal to discuss his feelings about any of it. He was, by all accounts, a difficult man. Not cruel. His daughter Rosamond had explained during the intake interview, pressing a tissue to the corner of her eye. Not deliberately difficult. Just a man who had spent 50 years issuing orders and receiving very few, that he didn't eventually find a way to countermand. The staff had learned to work around this. They kept the blinds at the angle he preferred, halfway, tilted toward the window. They brought his meals on the schedule. He sat rather than the unit's standard rotation. They did not, under any circumstances, put on the television without asking him first. Delphine had been assigned to Admiral Vane for reasons that were partly administrative. She was the most senior floor nurse on the daytime shift, and partly because the charge nurse, a sharp-eyed woman named Petra, who had been running this floor for 11 years, Petra had looked at Chester Vane's intake form, looked at Delphine, and made a decision without explaining it. "Room 14, Petra had said. "He's going to push. Don't let him." Delphine had not pushed back at Chester Vane, and Chester Vane had not particularly pushed at her, which was not the interaction either of them had been promised. He was sharp despite the medication, still capable of long-sustained arguments about naval procurement strategy in the 1,980 seconds. Still able to recall the names of every person who had served under him on the USS Forrestal in 1987. He was also dying. Clearly, conclusively, without ambiguity or hope of reversal. Delphine had seen enough of it to recognize the specific way his body was beginning to loosen from itself, the slight loosening of the jaw, the longer pauses between breaths during sleep, the way he had stopped asking about the news last week, his mind beginning the long backward walk that dying minds tend to take. She measured out the morphine. She prepared the anti-nausea medication. She knocked on the door of room 14. He was a large man, or had been. The illness had taken a significant toll on his frame, his shoulders narrowing in the way a structure narrows when the load-bearing walls start to give. But the posture remained, some deep-wire discipline that no amount of illness had been able to fully override, and his eyes, when he turned them toward Delphine, were still extraordinarily clear, dark brown and sharp. "Morning," Delphine said. She set down the medication cup on the bedside tray and reached for his wrist, beginning the morning assessment without ceremony. Pulse, respiration rate, temperature. She checked the oxygen sensor, clipped to his finger, noted the reading, made a mark on the tablet. "What are you giving me this morning?" he said. Not a question. The usual pain management, anti-nausea. She held out the cup. He took it without comment, which was itself a kind of comment. He had argued about his medication regimen for the first 2 weeks and had now arrived at a position of resigned compliance that Delphine recognized as its own form of surrender. She did not remark on it. His daughter Rosamond would arrive at 11, as she did every weekday, carrying a thermos of good coffee and a container of something she had cooked the night before that her father would eat 3 bites of and pronounce adequate. They had, by all visible evidence, loved each other deeply and imperfectly for his entire life and her entire life, which is about as much as most families manage. 2 of his former aides from the Pentagon would stop by on Thursday, as they did every 2 weeks, and they would talk for 2 hours about things Delphine did not need to understand to administer. This was the shape of his final week. Delphine had learned it the way she learned every patient's shape, not with sentiment, but with a thorough professional attention that was its own kind of care. She was checking the pressure relief settings on his mattress when Chester Vane said, without turning from the window, "You ever been in a hurry, Marchetti?" Delphine paused. "What kind of hurry?" "The kind where it doesn't matter what you're running toward, only what you're running from." He turned then very slowly and looked at her, not the casual glance he gave most of the staff. A longer look, deliberate and measuring. The kind of look that tries to find the architecture beneath a face. "You move like someone who's been in a hurry and stopped. You move like someone who's used to being watched," Delphine said. His mouth made the small, precise motion she had come to recognize as his version of a smile. "That is a diplomatic answer." She adjusted his blanket and noted his temperature on the chart and left room 14 without elaborating. The conversation stayed with her through the next 4 rooms. The medication rounds, the documentation, the handoff meeting with the night shift nurse. Chester Vane had been looking at her that way for 3 days now. She had attributed it to the progression. The brain metastases made some patients see familiar faces in unfamiliar ones, a harmless neurological blur, and she had not dwelt on it. The 7th floor had its own ecosystem, its own internal weather. She had learned it the way she had learned every theater she'd worked in, by paying close attention to the patterns. Which families came every day, and which came twice a week, and which left with the particular walk of people who needed distance to function. Which patients slept through the night, and which hit the call button at 3 a.m., not because anything was clinically wrong, but because 3 a.m. is the hour when the mind, unoccupied, fills itself with the things it cannot tolerate alone. She was good at the 3 a.m. work. She had always been good at sitting in the difficult hour with people who needed someone next to them in it. She brought the same quality to it she had once brought to certain other kinds of waiting, a stillness that was not passive, not absent, but quietly and completely present. The kind of stillness that costs something and is freely given anyway. Chester Vane had not called the button at 3 a.m. He was not that kind of man. But she had checked his chart on 3 consecutive overnight logs and found the same notation from Owen: Admiral awake, vital signs, stable, declined, offered water or medication, appeared to be watching the door, and she had understood without needing it spelled out that he was not sleeping through the nights as well as the daytime rounds suggested. This part is necessary because you can't understand what happened in room 14 on a Thursday morning in late October without understanding who was standing beside the bed. Delphine Marchetti had enlisted in the United States Navy at 1814. This was not unusual. What was unusual was that she had scored high enough on the ASFAB that the recruiter had leaned forward in his chair and said, in a voice that was trying to be casual and failing, that there were opportunities she might want to consider. She had considered them. She had gone to MEP. She had done the preliminary assessments for Special Operations Screening, which in 2008 was a thing that happened quietly, without fanfare, without acknowledgement, because women were not officially serving in the combat specialties that would eventually become officially open to them 6 years later, and the Navy was doing a number of things that it was not officially doing. She became a SARC candidate. Special Amphibious Reconnaissance Corpsman, the Navy SEAL support role that put medics with the teams on direct action and reconnaissance missions that required a medical presence. The training was 9 months of the most systematically brutal physical and psychological pressure the United States military had devised for human beings. Delphine Marchetti completed it. She deployed for the first time in 2011. Afghanistan, then a rotation to the Horn of Africa, then the expansion into the Syrian theater that was happening in ways the official record would later choose to describe with great vagueness. Her call sign was Rafe, which she had been given by her team leader and had never particularly liked, but she had learned long ago that call signs were not given on the basis of preference. She was a combat medic in the most direct sense of that phrase, not a medic who treated wounds behind the wire, but a medic who went through the wire with the team and treated wounds under fire. She was skilled at this in a way that other skilled people could recognize as a different category of skill. The kind that lives in the hands and the spine, rather than in the memory or the conscious mind. In the summer of 2014, she was part of a 4-person element that went into a compound outside Raqqa in support of a direct action mission. The intelligence was accurate. The compound held exactly what the briefing said it would hold. What the briefing did not account for was the secondary element that arrived 22 minutes into the exfil, a vehicle-mounted force that came up from the eastern approach and cut off the primary extraction route. Delphine had been providing cover fire from a rooftop position when a vehicle-borne IED detonated on the street below. The blast took out the eastern wall of the building she was on, dropped her through 2 floors of deteriorating concrete, and partially buried her under rubble. She regained consciousness to a compound on fire and an extraction window that had already been missed. She got out. This part of the story, the part between being buried under rubble in a burning building in Raqqa and surfacing 3 days later in a position from which she could make contact, is not part of this telling, because some things don't need to be narrated to be understood. The point is that she got out, and the team she had gone in with had already received the report of her death, and the machinery that processes the deaths of people who don't officially exist had already quietly processed it. She made contact with a single person she trusted. She was given a choice which was not really a choice in any meaningful sense, and she took the path that meant a new name, a new social security number, a completed nursing degree built on the medical knowledge she had accumulated in 9 years of special operations, and a life in which she was, officially, nobody who had ever done anything remarkable. The nursing degree had taken her 3 years, nights and weekends, an accelerated program that fast-tracked candidates with demonstrated clinical competence. She had demonstrated enough of it that 2 of her clinical supervisors had asked where she'd trained before, and she'd given a version of the truth that was technically accurate and completely misleading. Rural hospital attachment. It was not a lie so much as a translation, the way a map is a translation of terrain, accurate enough to navigate by missing the parts that would change the scale. She had chosen hospice because an oncology nurse she met during clinicals had told her with a matter-of-fact directness that Delphine had immediately respected, that most nurses ran from palliative care because they couldn't tolerate the losses, that the nurses who stayed were the ones who had reconsidered the premise, who had decided that being present for a loss was a different thing from causing it, and had found a way to live in that distinction without needing the patients to survive in order to feel that the work had meaning. Delphine had understood this immediately. She had been living in that distinction for years. She had been doing this for 10 years when Chester Vane looked at her with those dark, measuring eyes and asked her about Hurry. The second week of October, Chester Vane's condition changed. It changed in the way that the palliative care physician, Dr. Leona Archibald, had predicted, not dramatically, not suddenly, but in a series of small surrenders that accumulated over 72 hours into a new and diminished baseline. He slept more, he ate less. The conversations, which had previously ranged widely across decades of naval history and the considerable failures of various administrations, became shorter, more focused, and more fixed in the past. There is a progression in the final weeks of a life that most people only encounter from the outside, and it looks different from the inside of the room. The changes that seem, from the doorway, like a general dimming, are up close, a process of selection. The body and the mind, as they loosen from their ordinary obligations, the things that mattered most tend to be the things that surface: old debts, old griefs, the faces of people who define some significant passage. Chester Vane was not unusual in this. He was just more methodical about it, reviewing his life with the same systematic attention he had once brought to intelligence reports. He talked about his first command. He talked about a storm off the Cape Hatteras in 1979 that had taken 2 men and left him standing at the rail for an hour afterward without being able to explain why he hadn't gone in to look for them, when he had known the whole time that they were already gone. He talked about his wife, Marguerite, who had died of a brain aneurysm 7 years ago in their kitchen in Annapolis. Instantaneous, no warning, no goodbye, the kind of death that leaves the survivor with a permanent ambient guilt for not having said the right last words. Delphine listened to these conversations in the careful, present way she had learned to listen, not absorbing them, not reflecting them back, simply receiving them. She had discovered years ago that this was what dying people needed most from the people tending them. Not solutions, not consolation, not wisdom, just the steady presence of another person willing to sit in the weight of a life being reviewed, and not look away. She was changing the dressings on his forearm IV site on a Wednesday afternoon, when he said, without preamble, "I had a medic once. Carried me out of an ambush. Delphine did not change the pace of her hands. Tell me about it," she said in the mild, unhurried voice she used for these conversations. Iraqi border area, 1992. We were moving up a wadi, dry riverbed, north of the Saudi line. My intelligence officer had a bad feeling from the beginning. I should have listened to him. He paused, swallowed. They hit us at the narrowest point. RPG took out the lead vehicle. I was in the third truck. Windshield went in. He gestured vaguely at his face. Glass concussion. I was not functional. Were you hit? Superficially. The concussion was the problem. I couldn't walk a straight line. There was a young medic, one of the SEAL support elements that was attached to our team for the operation. I didn't know much about that world then. Didn't ask many questions. He stopped again. She picked me up. I don't mean helped me. I mean she physically picked me up, got me over her shoulders and moved approximately 300 meters under fire to get me behind cover. Delphine pressed a fresh adhesive carefully over the IV site. She was quiet about it, Chester Vane continued. Didn't talk during, just moved. Got me behind the vehicle. Did a quick assessment, professional, fast, no wasted motion, then left to go back for Lieutenant Commander Briggs, who had a femoral bleed. She saved him, too. A pause. She didn't know that. The whole operation was compartmentalized. I didn't learn until afterward who that element was, what unit they were from, even roughly. He turned his head to look at Delphine. Never found out who she was, specifically. Never got her name, I asked. That kind of information was very tightly held. Delphine peeled the backing off the last piece of tape. That must have stayed with you, she said. 40 years. Rosamund Vane was 48 and resembled her father in the most inconvenient way. She had his eyes, the same dark brown, the same unblinking directness, the same quality of assessment in a glance. She was an environmental attorney in Bethesda, and she visited every weekday and most weekend mornings, and she carried the weight of the vigil with the organized competence of someone who had decided to be responsible for this. She and Delphine had developed over 3 weeks, the particular relationship that forms between a nurse and the family member who is most present. Not quite friendship, not quite professional formality, something in between that is characterized by directness on both sides. "How was he today?" Rosamund asked on Wednesday evening, catching Delphine at the nurse's station during a chart update. "Talkative, more oriented than yesterday." Delphine turned to face her. "He's been spending a lot of time in 1992. Rosamund nodded. "He talks about it some. The Gulf War. He doesn't usually go into detail. He mentioned an ambush, a medic who carried him out." Something shifted in Rosamund's expression. Not quite surprise, more the recognition of a thing that had been carried a long time being set down in front of her. "He's told me that story twice in my whole life. Both times. At the end of a bottle of very good scotch." She looked at Delphine. "He always said that medic was the bravest person he ever watched work, and he watched a lot of people work." Delphine said nothing. "He said she was a woman," Rosamund added, "which he found remarkable. In 1992, in that context, he said he didn't realize it until the debrief because she'd been wearing full gear, and in the middle of it, there was no reason for that to be anything other than irrelevant." "That would have been unusual for that era," Delphine said. "He said the program was unofficial, that some of the special operations medical billets were being filled by women who were technically attached to other units on paper. Rosamund picked at the edge of her coffee cup. He tried to find her. Not obsessively, but he made inquiries. Twice. Both times he was told politely and firmly that the information was not available. Delphine organized her chart notes with deliberate attention. "He still thinks about her?" she asked. "He told me once that he still thinks about her every time he hears about someone being rescued," Rosamund said, "which is a lot, if you watch the news." She paused. "He says it changed his understanding of what capable means. That he'd spent 20 years in the Navy with a pretty clear idea of what kind of body and what kind of history could produce that level of competence under fire, and she'd rearranged it in about 4 minutes. "I'll check in before I leave," she said. She walked back down the hall. Her pulse was regular, her hands were still. These were things she noted, the way she had learned to note the physical facts of her own body, the way you note the readings on an instrument, not as lived experience, but as data, 40 years. She had thought about 1992 periodically over the years, the way you think about a thing you did before you understood it as something remarkable, not with pride exactly, more with a kind of factual acknowledgement. She had moved 2 people out of a kill zone in a dry riverbed north of the Saudi border. She had not known the rank of the first man because it was irrelevant to the problem of getting him behind cover. She had not asked names because there was no time for names. She had not known, and did not know now, whether the officer she had carried had survived the broader conflict, had gone on to have a life, had thought about those 4 minutes again. The carpet in the 7th floor hallway was mauve and institutional, and had been there since the early 2000s. Delphine walked it back to her station, and updated 3 charts, and went home at the end of her shift, and stood in her kitchen for a while without making dinner. Chester Vane's condition had shifted overnight. The night nurse, a quiet and competent man named Owen, flagged it in the handoff. More restlessness, brief intervals of confusion, an episode around 3 a.m. where the Admiral had been asking for Marguerite, and had taken a few minutes to reorient when Owen reminded him gently. Delphine reviewed the night notes. She prepared his morning medications. She knocked on room 14 at 7:12 a.m. He was awake. More than awake, he was sitting upright, which was unusual for a Thursday morning, and he was watching the door with a focused attention that made Delphine pause in the doorway. "Good morning," she said. The look was different this time, not the slow, measuring look of the past week, the one she had attributed to the brain metastases and the natural drift of a dying mind through familiar territory. This look was direct and completely clear, and had the quality of arrival. "Come here," he said. Delphine set down the medication tray and crossed to the bedside. He was looking at her face with the concentrated attention of someone solving a problem they've been sitting with for a very long time. "You have a scar," he said. "Right edge of your jawline, 1/2 inch, almost parallel to the bone." Delphine's expression did not change. "Bike accident?" she said. "Years ago." "That's not a bike accident," Chester Vane said. His voice was steady and flat and certain. "That's fragmentation, fine grain. The pattern is distinctive. I've been looking at it for 3 weeks. He paused. "I have one on my left forearm, same source." "Same waddy?" The oxygen concentrator ran its slow mechanical cycle in the corner. Down the hall a cartwheel squeaked. "Admiral," Delphine said. "Let me." "There was a woman," he said, and his voice was not confused, was not the drifting voice of the overnight episodes Owen had documented. It was the voice of a man who had been waiting to say something for a long time, and had arrived finally at the place where he could say it. In 1992, she picked me up. She was exactly your height. I know hands, Marchetti. 50 years commanding people. You learn hands. She had your economy of motion. She had your particular way of not making a sound when she works. He stopped. His breathing was measured and effortful. I know I'm dying. My brain is doing things I can't entirely control, and I've made my peace with that. But I am clear right now. I am looking at you, and I am telling you that I know. Delphine stood very still beside the bed of the dying Admiral. Outside the 7th-floor windows, the October sky was the particular thin blue of the mid-Atlantic coast in autumn, cold and sharp. She could say, "You're confused. Let me adjust your medications. Let me get Dr. Archibald." She could say nothing. She could leave the room on some clinical pretext, and not come back until Rosamund arrived. She had built 10 years of a life on knowing when to be nobody, and how to stay that way. Chester Vane was watching her. His dark eyes were tired and clear and patient in the way of a person who has stopped being in a hurry. Delphine pulled the chair close to the bed and sat down. She did not confirm it in words, because some things don't require words between two people who have both spent their lives in the company of people who communicate in something more direct than language. She sat down. The decision was in the posture, in the ceasing to move toward the exit. Chester Vane exhaled slowly. Something in the set of his jaw loosened. "I tried to find you," he said. Rosamund arrived at 11:03, which was 11 minutes later than her usual time, because there had been an accident on the bridge. She walked into room 14 to find her father talking to his nurse with a focused animation that she had not seen from him in 2 weeks. She stood in the doorway. Chester Vane turned to look at his daughter and said clearly and without preamble, "This is the woman Rosa." Rosamund looked at Delphine. Delphine held the look for a moment, then looked back at Chester Vane with a slight expression that said, "You didn't ask me before you said that." "Dad," Rosamund said carefully. "What are you?" "The medic," he said from the wadi. "I've been telling you about her for 40 years. She's here. She's been here for 3 weeks. He gestured at Delphine with a hand that still, despite everything, had commanded the gesture. "It took me 3 weeks because I was looking at scrubs and a clean hospital room and I was sick. But I recognized her." Rosamund crossed the room slowly and sat in the second chair that had been pulled close to the bed. She looked at Delphine with the same dark, assessing eyes as her father and said nothing for a moment. "Is it true?" she asked. Delphine considered this. She had been considering it in various forms for the past 3 hours. "I was a Navy SOC," she said. "I was attached to SEAL elements in a support capacity between 2011 and 2014. I had one deployment in the Gulf region in late 1992 as part of a temporary duty assignment that doesn't appear in any official record. I was in a dry riverbed north of the Saudi border in the summer of that year. I don't know if I moved the same man. I don't know if the man I moved is the man in this room. I wasn't given names. I didn't ask for them." Another pause. "But I've been in this room for 3 weeks, and I've been listening to him talk, and everything he knows is consistent with what I was there for." Rosamund looked at her father. Chester Vane looked at the ceiling with the expression of a man who has finally been given something he has been asking for a very long time and doesn't quite know what to do with it, now that it is here. "That's enough," he said. His voice was rough. "That's sufficient." He turned to look at Delphine. "Why nursing, after all that?" Delphine thought about how to answer this honestly. "Because I was already a medic," she said. because it was a life I could live without having to pretend to be someone else. The medicine was familiar. The patients were... It was the same work in some ways, just without the fire. Rosamond made a quiet sound that was not quite a laugh. "And no one knew," she said. "That was the arrangement," Delphine said. "It was the correct arrangement. I'm not. This is not a story I'm telling because I need credit for it. I'm telling it because he asked, because he knew, because it seemed wrong to deny it to a man who is running out of days to have questions answered." Chester Vane looked at his hands. They were large and spotted with age, and trembling slightly with the constant low effort of being sick. He turned one over, looked at the palm. "You didn't know who I was," he said, "when you carried me out." "I knew you were a person in the road," Delphine said. "That was all the information I needed." He was quiet for a long time. The oxygen concentrator ran. Down the hall, someone's family was talking in low voices over lunch. Rosamond reached over and put her hand over her father's and held it without saying anything. "I've been trying to understand something for 40 years, Chester Vane said finally. His voice was very quiet now, stripped of the command register he used when he was well. Why someone would do that? Run back into a burning vehicle exfil for a person they don't know. The correct tactical decision was to leave me and extract the element. "Yes," Delphine said. "I know why soldiers do it for each other. Unit cohesion. The bond of the team obligation." "No," Delphine said. "So why?" She thought about this for a moment. Not because the answer was complicated, but because she had never been asked to put it into language before. "Because you were in the road," she said again, and this time he understood it for what it was. Not a deflection, but the complete and sufficient answer. Some things don't have a justification that lives above the level of their own. Plain fact. He was in the road. She was capable of doing something about it. The rest was just physics. Chester Vane closed his eyes. Rosamond stayed through the afternoon. Around 2 o'clock, Chester Vane drifted into sleep, not the restless, confusing sleep Owen had documented, but a deep and apparently peaceful sleep, his breathing slow and even, his face relaxed in the unguarded way that faces only go when the architecture is truly resting. Rosamond and Delphine sat in the room together for a few minutes, not speaking. Then Rosamond said quietly, "He's been asking about her, about you, for as long as I can remember. Not obsessively, but it comes up. He brought it up at my wedding. He mentioned it at the memorial when Mom died. There's a photograph he has, just of the wadi. No people. He took it just after. He's kept it in his desk drawer for 40 years. Delphine listened. He would say, he said it to me maybe 6 times over the years, that the best thing he ever saw a person do, he saw it done by someone he never knew and never got to thank. That it had been unfinished business his entire life." Rosamond stopped. He didn't know if she was alive. He didn't know if she'd gotten out. He just knew he owed a debt and couldn't pay it. "He doesn't owe a debt," Delphine said. "I know that. You know that. He's never believed it." Rosamond turned to look at her, those dark, assessing eyes, very direct and honest. "Can I ask you something? Go ahead. In your line of work, in both lines, both lives, do you have a version of unfinished business? Something you carried?" Delphine thought about the Iraqi border in 1992, about the wadi and the burning vehicle and 2 men she had never known and could not have found in any database because the databases had been designed to make sure of it. She thought about whether they had gotten out of the broader operation, whether the one with the femoral wound had made it through the hour after she left him, whether any of them had thought about those 4 minutes again. "I wondered if they got out." she said. Both of them. One of them got out, Rosamond said. Delphine nodded. They sat together in the quiet room while Chester Vane slept the deep sleep of the finally unburdened, and the October afternoon moved slow and cold across the 7th-floor windows. And somewhere down the hall a family was beginning the particular kind of conversation that happens when the doctors have said what they've said, and there is nothing left to do but hold the good things up to the light and look at them before they go. Chester Vane had 9 days after that Thursday morning. In those 9 days his condition followed the trajectory doctor. Archibald had outlined the gradual loosening of the body from its ordinary functions, the extension of the sleep periods, the reduction of the lucid windows. He was comfortable. The pain management was precise and effective, and Delphine kept it that way with a clinical attention that she would have brought to any patient, and that she brought to this one without any additional sentiment that she allowed herself to examine too closely. He had 2 more conversations with her that she would remember. The first was on a Friday, his 3rd day after the Thursday revelation, when he was still having windows of clarity in the mornings. He asked her about the life she'd built, the nursing degree, the hospice work, the apartment she lived in, whether she had people she trusted. She answered honestly and briefly, which was the only way she knew to answer things. She had her work. She had a very small number of people she trusted, none of whom knew the full version of her history. She had built a life that was quiet and purposeful and gave her no reason to flinch when she passed a mirror. "Do you miss it?" he asked. "The other life?" "Yes." She thought about this with the same honest attention she brought to clinical questions. "I miss the clarity," she said. "In that work, everything is very clear. The problem is in front of you. The tools are in your hands. Either it works or it doesn't. There's no ambiguity about what success looks like." She paused. "Hospice is the same. In some ways, the parameters are very clear. The goal is comfort, not cure. I know exactly what I'm doing here and why." He was quiet for a moment. "You found something equivalent," he said. "I think so." "Good," he said. And then after a pause, "But good," she laughed, which surprised her. It was a short, genuine laugh, not a polite clinical response. Chester Vane looked briefly pleased with himself, which was the most animated she'd seen him in days. The second conversation was on a Monday, 6 days before he died, when the lucid windows were shorter and harder to reach, and the morphine requirements had increased to the point where he was spending most of his time. He surfaced for about 20 minutes in the early afternoon, and Delphine was in the room adjusting his drip. He looked at her for a while. "I want you to know something," he said. "What's that?" "In my line of work, you spend a lot of time thinking about what you're responsible for. Who lived, who didn't, what decisions you made, and whether you could have made them differently." He breathed. "You're supposed to carry it. It's the price of the rank of the authority, the weight of the lives that went the wrong way." Delphine stood at the bedside. "I've been carrying your weight for 40 years, he said, not out of obligation. "Just because I thought you were gone, and I had been the reason someone like you ended up in that wadi, and I couldn't balance that ledger." His voice was very quiet now, attenuated by the medication and the effort of being upright in time. "I know now. That's not mine to carry. You carried yourself out. You've been carrying yourself ever since." He looked at her with those still clear eyes. "I'm giving it back to you. Whatever portion of your story I've been holding, I'm giving it back." Delphine was quiet for a moment. "Admiral," she said, "I never asked you to hold it." "I know," he said. "That's why it's mine to put down." "I'm very tired, Marchetti. "Sleep," she said. He slept. Chester Vane died on a Wednesday at 4:17 in the morning, while the 7th floor was quiet, and the overnight shift was doing its rounds, and the October night pressed cold and dark against the windows. Owen called Delphine at 4:21, not because protocol required it, but because he knew she'd want to know before she came in. She lay in her apartment for a while, with her eyes open and the ceiling fan turning above her. She had been through this transition many times. The phone call, the quiet minutes after, the specific weight of a death you have attended closely. She had learned to let it move through her rather than around her. This was part of the work. She came in early. Rosamond was already there, having received Owen's call, sitting in the chair beside the bed with her father's hand in both of hers, and the quiet, composed expression of a person who has been preparing for this and is allowing themselves to feel it anyway. Delphine stood in the doorway. She did not enter the room immediately. She let Rosamond have the space. After a few minutes, Rosamond looked up and said, "Come in." Delphine came in. She stood at the foot of the bed for a moment, looking at Chester Vane, who looked in death as he had in his deepest sleep. The face relaxed, the posture, finally and completely released from its 50-year discipline. Just a man, just a body, still and finished. "He was ready," Delphine said. "He was," Rosamond agreed. "He said so Wednesday morning when I left Tuesday evening. He said, 'I'll be done soon, Rosa.' He said it like he was scheduling a meeting." Delphine stood quietly. "He gave me something to give to you," Rosamond said. She reached into her bag and produced an envelope, unsealed, with Delphine's first name written on the outside, in a handwriting that was still firm and precise, despite everything it had been through. Delphine took the envelope. Inside was a single folded sheet of naval letterhead, old letterhead, the kind from decades past, with the Navy seal embossed at the top. The writing was brief. "Marchetti, I spent 40 years trying to pay a debt that wasn't payable. I've been told it doesn't work like that. I believe it now. For what it's worth, from someone who watched a person operate at the full measure of what a person can do. I know what you are. I know what you're doing here. It is not a waste. It is the same thing you've always been doing, which is keeping people alive. Take good care of yourself, because you're worth keeping." Vain Delphine folded the letter. She put it in the breast pocket of her scrub top. Rosamond was watching her. "He was something," Delphine said. "He was," Rosamond said. "He spent 40 years carrying the idea of you. I think he died lighter." Delphine nodded. She reached out and straightened the blanket over Chester Vane's hands, a small, unnecessary gesture, the kind of motion that has no clinical purpose and is entirely human. Then she stepped back and let the room begin its process of becoming an empty room again. She stayed through the full shift. There was documentation to complete, family to support through the logistics of what comes next, the mechanics of a death in an institutional setting that are nobody's favorite part but that someone has to do carefully and well. She did them carefully and well. At the end of the shift, Petra stopped her at the nurse's station with a look that said she knew more than she was going to ask about. "You all right?" Petra asked. Petra looked at her for a moment with the 11-year veteran's dread on a person's actual state, and appeared to conclude that this was true. "He was a good patient," Petra said. "In the end, he was," Delphine agreed. She took the elevator down and walked through the lobby and out through the glass doors of Mercy Providence into the October afternoon, which was cold and clear and bright in the way of late October in the mid-Atlantic, the kind of light that has been scrubbed clean by the first cold fronts of the season. She stood on the sidewalk outside the hospital for a moment, her bag over her shoulder, the letter in her breast pocket pressing its small, warm weight against her sternum. The street was ordinary. Cars, pedestrians, a delivery truck, double parked on the corner. The ordinary continuity of a world that goes on doing what it does, regardless of what happens inside the buildings. She had lived 10 years in the middle of this ordinary world with the specific intention of being nothing remarkable within it. She had not, she thought now, entirely succeeded at this, which was probably fine. Some things you carry don't stop being true because you carry them quietly. Chester Vane had spent 40 years holding a version of her story. It had been, she understood now, its own kind of monument. Not to her, exactly, but to the fact of what had happened. The plain fact of one person doing what could be done for another person in a dry riverbed. She had been trying for 10 years not to be the person that story was about. She thought now that this had been, in its own way, its own form of carrying something too heavy. She put her hand over her breast pocket, feeling the weight of the letter through the thin scrub fabric. 40 years was a long time to carry something. 9 days was enough to put it down. She started walking. The afternoon was cold and bright, and she had nowhere to be until morning, when she would come back to the 7th floor and begin again the work of staying close to people at the end of things, which was, she had decided years ago and believed more than ever now, the most necessary kind of work there is. She walked. The October light hit the buildings at that angle. It only hits in autumn. Everything a little too sharp and a little too beautiful. The kind of light that makes the ordinary world look briefly like something else. She let it. The stories that don't get told are not always the stories of failure. Some of them are the stories of people who did exactly what they were built to do, and then, for reasons that made complete sense at the time, chose to disappear, to become nobody. To walk away from the version of themselves that history might have remembered and build a smaller, quieter life in a hospital on a floor where people come to die. Delphine Marchetti had been a Navy SEAL combat medic. She had operated in conditions that most people will never encounter and will never be asked to encounter, and she had done so with a competence that one officer had kept inside him for 40 years. Like a stone in his pocket, smooth and permanent and weighted with everything it represented. She had carried a man out of an ambush. She had spent 10 years being nobody who had ever done anything remarkable. And then a dying admiral in a hospice room on a mauve-carpeted floor, in an ordinary mid-Atlantic city, had looked at the scar on the edge of her jaw and recognized the grain of the world they had shared for 4 minutes. On a hot afternoon in 1992. The best medic in the teams, his team leader had once said, she'd rearranged his understanding of what capable means. She was adjusting morphine drips now, straightening blankets, sitting in the weighted quiet beside people who were running out of days and needed the company of someone who would not flinch or look away. Same work, different, fire. Some things you do because they're in front of you, and some things you keep doing in different forms, in different rooms, under different names, because you are built for them at the level below language. Below choice, the level where the hands know what to do before the mind has finished asking. Delphine Marchetti walked home in the October light, with a letter over her heart, and 40 years of someone else's gratitude finally released back to the air where it belonged. She would be back on the 7th floor at 7 in the morning. There would be new patients, and new families and new ends of things. There would always be more people who needed someone steady beside them in the difficult country at the edge of their lives. She had always been good at this. It was in the end the same gift. If this story stayed with you, if it found something real in you, Please take a second to like it and share it with someone who ought to hear it. Subscribe to the channel for more stories about the lives lived beneath the surface of the ordinary world, the ones that happen in silence and matter completely. We'll see you in the next one.